Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Every leader has to master the art of giving and receiving feedback, but something so seemingly simple can be hard to do. Drawing on her experiences as an executive at Google and Apple, Kim Scott developed a framework to become an effective manager, starting with better communication. Radical candor is a simple idea. To be a good boss, you have to care personally and challenge directly. Her book, Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity, is a New York Times bestseller and inspired a management revolution. The second edition, featuring a new preface, afterword, and bonus chapter, is going to be available October of 2019. On today's episode, we talk about how to create a culture of feedback and the do's and don'ts of radical candor. This simple framework will guide every conversation you have and help you build better relationships. Let's get right into it. Here's my candid conversation with Kim Scott. Kim Scott, thank you for coming on. I know you are a busy woman, and I appreciate you taking a minute.
It's a thrill to chat with you. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, it's awesome. So for those of the folks that are listening who haven't read Radical Candor yet being the key word, what's the big takeaway?
The big takeaway is that you don't have to choose between sort of being a successful jerk and caring about the people you work with. I think very early in my career, I got an article mailed to me from about 10 different people. And it was about how people would rather have a boss who's really competent but an asshole than a boss who's really nice but incompetent. And I thought, are they sending me this because they think I'm an asshole or because they think I'm incompetent? And which one of those things is worse? And surely those are not my two choices.
Sure.
So you don't have to choose between being an asshole and being successful. You can actually be kind and be successful. So the core idea of radical candor is great leaders know how to show they care personally about their employees at the same time that they challenge them directly. And that's the idea in a nutshell. That's it.
So feedback with love.
Yes, feedback, but it's also about thinking through how you build your team and how you achieve results. As a boss, relationships are at the core of your ability to fulfill your responsibilities. And you have three responsibilities. You want to create a culture of feedback. If all the feedback lands on your shoulders, you're going to get crushed. So you want to create a culture of feedback. You also want to build a great team, and you give feedback to that team with the ultimate goal of achieving results. And so all of those three things, if you think you can create a culture of feedback, build a great team, and achieve great results without great relationships, I think you're just kidding yourself.
Sure. So when you talk about caring personally and you think about that in action, can you break that down for our listeners?
Yes, absolutely. Caring personally does not mean getting creepily personal. What caring personally is about is remembering that even though these are not friendships, they are real human relationships. And you've got to give them the time that they deserve and the attention that they deserve. Early in my career, I had an experience where I had blocked the first 2 hours of the day off to make an important pricing decision. And I walked in the door of the office, and one of my employees came up to me, and he was having a major medical situation. And so I talked to him, got him to a sort of calmer place, did what I could to support him. And then I'm walking, so half an hour has passed. Now I'm walking to my desk. I'm just half an hour late. It's going to be okay, right? And I passed by another guy, and his son is in the intensive care unit. And I can't just say to him, how's it going? I know how it's going. His life is living hell.
Sure.
And so I spent some time with him, convincing him he should leave the office. Even if his son didn't need him in the ICU, he should go take care of himself for the next few days. So now I'm an hour late to make but I still have an hour. I still have a good hour. And I walk past another employee who jumps up and tells me very excitedly that his son has just won the best mathematician in New York award. And so now it's like emotional whiplash. I've gone from great sympathy to celebration. I finally arrive at my desk and I am exhausted. I'm wrung out and I have no capacity left to make this pricing decision. So I just called my coach and I said, "What am I? Am I a part-time therapist or am I a CEO?" And she yells at me. She says, "Kim, this is called management and it is your job." And I think very often we forget that a fundamental part of our job is the emotional labor inherent in these relationships that we have at work. And I think we forget to give it the time and the space that it deserves. So that's kind of a long-winded way to say that's what I mean by caring personally. There's a lot of specific suggestions in the book about ways that you can appropriately show you care personally. I talk about how to have career conversations that begin with the get to know you conversation and that sort of thing. But it's really caring personally at work is not about taking time away from work necessarily. It is often about just remembering in the moment that you're working with a human being.
With a heart and a soul, no question.
Yeah. Yeah. Who'll do better work if you
Absolutely.
if you see all that.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at your matrix, right? So when we think about, you've defined so well what is radical candor, but what isn't radical candor, right? What isn't it?
Yes. So if radical candor is about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time, it's very hard, and it's hard because of training that we get since we get our first job. We're 18 years old, and we're right at that moment in our lives when our personas are beginning to solidify, but our egos are maximally fragile. And someone comes along and says, "Be professional," and I think all too often we translate that to mean as leave your emotions, leave your identity, leave your humanity, leave everything that's best about you at home and show up at work like some kind of robot. You can't possibly care personally if you're showing up like some kind of robot. So that's one thing that makes it hard. The second thing that makes radical candor hard is this challenge directly. This is what I think of as the willingness to piss people off dimension of radical candor. And very often we're not willing to piss people off because we've been taught since we learned to speak. So this problem begins not when we're 18 years old, but when we're 18 months old. We've been taught since we learned to speak, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. But now all of a sudden it's your job to say it. So those are the two fundamental reasons why radical candor is so hard. And one of the things I've done, as you mentioned, to make it a little bit easier is to give words to what happens when we fail on one dimension or another. So sometimes we remember to challenge directly, but we fail to show that we care personally. And then we wind up in what I call the obnoxious aggression quadrant. And I used to call this the asshole quadrant, but I stopped doing it for a very important reason. I stopped doing it because as soon as I did that, people would use the radical candor framework to start writing names in boxes. And I beg of you, don't use this framework that way. This is not another Myers-Briggs test. This is not a personality test. These are mistakes that we make all the time. So try to use these words to guide conversations to a better place, not to judge yourself or to judge others. So that's obnoxious aggression. When you do remember to challenge directly, but you fail to show you care personally. Now, very often when we realize we've been a jerk, instead of moving the right direction on care personally, we move the wrong direction on challenge directly. We sort of say, "Oh, I didn't really mean it. Doesn't really matter." But of course we did mean it and it does matter. And then you wind up in the worst place of all. And that is what I call manipulative insincerity. And this is an innocuous example is the false apology. But this is also where backstabbing behavior, political behavior, sort of real toxic
Mm-hmm.
workplace behavior creeps in. And it's fun to tell stories about manipulative insincerity and obnoxious aggression. If you watch Silicon Valley or look at the Dilbert cartoons, it's all about those kinds of behavior. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of us make the vast majority of our mistakes in the last quadrant, in the last of the four quadrants. And this is what happens when you do remember to show that you care personally, but you're so worried about not hurting the other person's feelings that you fail to tell them something they'd be better off knowing. And that's what I call ruinous empathy. So that's the radical candor framework. And radical candor is what to do. Obnoxious aggression, manipulative insincerity, and ruinous empathy are what not to do. But the fact of the matter is, we make those mistakes, all of us, including me, all day long.
Sure. And I think so much of this, I know, you have learned throughout your life, but you worked at Google and Apple, two incredible brands, of course. How were those two cultures, similar, different, particularly from maybe a management perspective, when you think about radical candor, what it is and what it isn't? What can you share with our listeners that they could learn from that?
I think both of the cultures, I mean, they were surprisingly different, given that they're both tech companies and they're about 20 minutes apart driving. But I would say that Google had a very strong culture of radical candor with perhaps a twist of ruinous empathy. People, if they tended in one direction, they tended not to say what they were really thinking. Apple had a very strong culture of radical candor with perhaps a twist of obnoxious aggression. The care personally wasn't always.
I can't. Was that a little bit of a trickle down from Mr. Steve Jobs by chance?
Steve, I think that he gets a lot of flack. And I would describe him, for example, before he died, Tim Cook, who was his COO at the time, offered to give Steve part of his liver because he was, and I don't know of any word that you can use to describe such a sacrifice other than love.
Sure.
And Steve Jobs refused the sacrifice. And I don't know of any word you can use to describe refusing to take such a sacrifice other than love. He wasn't going to allow Tim to do that. So I do think that he cared personally in a very strong way, about as strong as it gets, about the people who he was closest to. But he often behaved in a way that others interpreted as obnoxious aggression, to be clear. There's a really good video called The Lost Interview. And this was an interview with Steve Jobs. It was the outtakes of the documentary Triumph of the Nerds. And it's really interesting. He talks about giving feedback, and the interviewer asks him, sometimes you tell people your work is shit. What did you mean by that? And so that would at first blush fall into the obnoxious aggression category. No doubt about it. And Steve's response at first falls into the obnoxious aggression category. And he's like, well, usually I meant their work was shit. And the interviewer just kind of can't believe it. And he says, well, so-and-so says what you really meant when you said that was, I don't quite understand it. Could you explain it again? And Steve laughs again and says something else that's kind of obnoxious. But then he pauses and he takes the question seriously. And he says, when you are a leader and you're responsible for a collective team's efforts and you're surrounded by people who have great confidence in their abilities, sometimes it's your job to tell people in a way that they will hear when their work isn't nearly good enough. And he says, you want to do that in a way, and he's careful. He catches himself. He almost says they are not, but you want to tell them when their work is not nearly good enough. And then he says, and you want to tell them that in a way that shows that you have confidence in their abilities, but that leaves no room for misinterpretation, that the work is not nearly good enough. And he pauses and he says, and that's a hard thing to do. And so he didn't always get it right. Sometimes he like all of us, landed in obnoxious aggression. But I think that in his closest relationships, there was clearly a lot of care personally.
No, it sounds like his intent was radical candor, certainly with the relationships that were closest to him.
Yeah, maybe his intent, or maybe not his intent. Maybe not always his. I mean, none of us are perfect all the time.
Sure,
And
sure.
also, I think very often a person is not aware of the impact that they're having on others. And if you're a leader, by the way, it is your job to become aware of the impact you're having on others. Ignorance is no excuse.
Exactly. And you worked, obviously, at Google. You worked for Sheryl Sandberg, I know. How did Sheryl embody radical candor in your mind?
Well, there's a story I tell in the book about an experience I had shortly after joining Google. I had to give a talk to a presentation to the CEO and the founders about how the AdSense business was doing. And I walked into the room, and there was Eric Schmidt, who was CEO at the time, with his head so deep in his computer and his email, it's like his brain had been plugged into the machine. And there in the other corner of the room was Sergey Brin, one of the founders, on an elliptical trainer in toe shoes.
Oh, nice. Efficiency. Wow.
Yeah, and like any normal person in this situation, I felt a little bit nervous. It was not clear how I was supposed to get their attention. Luckily for me, the business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added, Eric almost fell off his chair and he said, "What do you need? Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineers? This is incredible." And so I'm feeling like the meeting was going okay. In fact, I now believe I'm a genius. And as I walked out of the room, I passed by Sheryl, and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead, Sheryl says, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I thought, oh, wow, I have screwed something up, and I'm sure I'm about to hear about it. And Sheryl began the conversation by telling me about the things that had gone well in the meeting. And the things and not telling me in the feedback sandwich or the shit sandwich kind of sense of the word, but really seeming to mean what she was saying. And in fact, telling me some things that I hadn't been aware of. But of course, all I wanted to do was hear how I had messed up. And eventually Sheryl said to me, "You said a lot in there. Were you aware of it?" And now I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because if that was all I had done wrong, who really cared? I had a tiger by the tail, and I sort of made a brush off gesture with my hand, and I said, "Yeah, I know. It's kind of a verbal tick. It's no big deal, really." And then Sheryl said, "I know this great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction?" And once again, I made this brush off gesture with my hand. And I said, "No, I'm busy. Didn't you hear about all those new customers? I don't have time for a speech coach." And then Sheryl stopped and she looked right at me and she said, "I can see when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." Now she's got my full attention. Yeah. and some people might say it was mean of Sheryl to say that I sounded stupid. But in fact, it was the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career, because if she hadn't said it to me with just those words, and by the way, she wouldn't have had to use those words with other people on her team, and she wouldn't have, in fact, used those words. But I'm a little stubborn, so she had to use those words to get through to me. If she hadn't said it just that way, I would never have gone to see the speech coach, and I wouldn't have realized that she was not exaggerating. I literally said, I watched myself on video, a painful experience to be avoided if you can help it. But anyway, I literally said every third word. This was news to me because I had been giving presentations for my whole career. I had raised millions of dollars for a couple of different startups, giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. And so this really made me think, like, why had no one told me? It was almost as though I'd been walking through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth, and nobody had told me about it. And so this made me wonder, what was it about Sheryl that made it so seemingly natural for her to tell me, but also why had no one else told me? And as I thought about it, I realized in the case of Sheryl, it really boiled down to those two things. It was care personally. I knew that she had my back. When I first, and not just me, everyone who worked directly with Cheryl knew that she had their back. When I first moved from New York to California to take the job, I didn't really know many people here in California, and I was lonely. And Cheryl could tell I was lonely and introduced me to a great book group. And so it was, and that was the kind of thing she did, not just for me, but for everyone who
Cool.
worked directly with her. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, relationships don't scale. Cheryl's a human being and can only have a limited number of them. So she couldn't do that kind of thing for all 5,000 people in her organization. But by doing it for the people who worked directly for her and most closely with her, they then kind of automatically did it with their teams. And it created a real culture, a real caring culture that did scale. So
That's
that was care
awesome.
personal. That was care personally. But I also knew that Cheryl was never going to be so worried about my short-term feelings that she was going to fail to tell me about something that I needed to hear about. So that was the challenge directly.
That's powerful. And I've heard you talk about that. And I think everybody that's listening can relate to the fact that we've all had moments that are, that was less than a couple minutes where you get feedback that really changes the way that you do what you do. It's powerful. I remember one of my first jobs, I was fresh out of college pretty much, and I was sitting in my office, and the head guy, our leader, walks in, and he sort of calmly leans on my desk and leans over to me and looks at me and he says, "Hey, you say dude way too much and you've got to stop. And you're not in college anymore. Grow up and lose it." And it was really powerful. And I see him and thank him for it.
Yeah, but it kind of stung a little
bit. Absolutely. You know it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It didn't feel good at all, but it was very impactful. I'm super grateful that he did that.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think if everyone listening can think of their story like that, what was that moment in your career where someone pulled you aside and told you something that it didn't feel great in the moment to hear about it, but it helped you. It helped you do better in your career for the rest of your career. I think if we all can become a little bit more aware of those moments and share them with others, it can really help us remember to be radically candid in the moment and to really treat radical candor as a gift and not a punishment, because it is when delivered in the right way.
Well, and I think for leaders too, for us to be able to do it, it shows such tremendous support to the people that we work with. And I remember early in my career, the gentleman that I worked for, one of our clients, a big-time NBA coach, walked into the office and he started to share some things with the leader of our company. And he kind of paused and took a deep breath and looked at me. I was a female, and he looked at the gentleman that ran the business, and he sort of smiled at me and he said, "She probably doesn't need to hear this. She probably ought to leave." And he looked right at the client who paid us, right, and said, "She knows everything I know. She's not leaving."
Wow.
And it was a lesson for me on he had my back totally. And that was cool. But that was a moment, again, where now running my own business, I try to do the same thing for the people that I lead. But as leaders, there's so many ways to think about this feedback and allow it to support and serve the people that we lead. It's a powerful thing.
The thing that's so great about that story is what he did in showing you that he had your back and in saying she's not leaving. That demonstrated that he cared personally more than an infinite number of lunches and dinners.
Exactly.
And, I think
absolutely.
So often we think that care personally is what we do at the offsite, and it's not. It's the way we work day in and day out. These moments are so powerful and so impactful when we handle them well.
How much better would your last negotiation have been if you knew how to get everything you wanted in the deal? Most people are afraid to negotiate because they haven't been taught the right skills. Instead, you're left feeling frustrated and missing opportunities. Whether you're in sales, HR, or executive leadership, we all have to negotiate. Our Game Changer negotiation training workshops provide a framework to help you negotiate with confidence. Crush your goals and stop wondering whether you could have achieved a better outcome. Sign up today for our next one-day workshop in Atlanta on November 7th. Register today at GameChanger360.com. That's GameChanger360.com. So how do people effectively solicit feedback? How do we search it out too so that we can get better?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because there's a definite order of operations to building radical candor and building a culture of radical candor and building a relationship of radical candor. And it starts with soliciting feedback. I think one of the things that's great about that story I just told you is that it's memorable and it's relatable. But one of the dangerous things about that story is it can leave people with the impression that radical candor is all about bosses criticizing employees, and nothing could be further from the truth. The first order of operations with radical candor is to solicit feedback, to figure out how to get the people around you telling you the truth about what they're thinking. So there's a couple of good moments to do it. I think one good moment to solicit feedback is sort of at the end of a one-on-one, after the other person has gone through their agenda items and you've listened attentively. It's good to save a couple of minutes to say, there's one more thing, to ask for feedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
And another good moment to ask for feedback, as long as you yourself are not angry, is when someone else is really mad at you. It's our instinct to avoid people when they're mad at us, but often they'll tell us that we can use the emotion in the room to get the truth out of someone. So that's another good moment. Now, I think there are there's a lot of steps to doing this, but I'll boil it down to 4. The first thing to think about is how you're going to ask. What words are you going to use? Because if you just say, do you have any feedback for me? You're wasting your breath. I can already tell you what the answer is. Oh, no, everything's fine. So you want to figure out how to ask the question. Don't ask a question that can be answered with a yes or a no. You want to ask a question in a way that is most likely to elicit an answer, and that also feels authentic. So the question that I often like to use is, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? But that's not going to work for everyone. That question is not going to work for everyone. I was talking to Krista Quarles when she was the CEO of OpenTable, and she said, I could never imagine those words coming out of my mouth. She said, the question I like to use is, tell me why I'm smoking crack. So that's fine. Like, there's a lot of different ways to ask the same question. And the other problem with that question is it's not going to work for everyone. So I started this company. We do talks and workshops and help leaders roll out radical candor on their teams. And I started it with Jason Rosoff. And he told me, after we had been working for a little while together, that he hated that question because it felt so abstract to him that he wasn't sure I really meant it. And so with him, I've got to make sure that I'm asking more specific questions around a particular meeting we were just in together or something like that. So you want to make sure you're asking the question in a way that feels authentic to you and is also adapted to the person you're talking to. So that's your go-to question. And if listeners do only one thing as a result of listening to this, if you can just come up with your go-to question, your time will not have been wasted. So figure out how you're going to ask. Now, the next thing to keep in mind after you've figured out how you're going to ask your question is to realize that you've got to embrace the discomfort. Even if you come up with the world's greatest question, the person who you ask feedback from is likely to feel uncomfortable. They really don't want to give you feedback. And it's tempting to sort of try to alleviate the discomfort in the room, to let the person off the hook. Maybe you try to answer your own question. Maybe you just start talking. The best thing to do to embrace the discomfort is just to shut your mouth and count to 6. Six seconds just sounded like a really long time.
And you were testing me. You were going to see if I was going to cave.
You did not cave.
I had a chapter in my book called The Power of the Pause. It's a powerful thing.
It is very, very powerful.
But it's so weird, right? People, it's uncomfortable and it's weird. Even just then, it's weird.
Yeah, it feels very awkward. In fact, a lot of radical candor is actually just pushing through that kind of awkwardness and letting it be. So usually, if you can be silent for 6 to 10 seconds, somebody will say something. Sometimes they won't, and you probably don't want to let it go longer than 10 seconds. You say, well, I'll give you a chance to think about it and schedule a next meeting, and then really hold their feet to the fire the next time. But usually someone will say something. So now you've dragged this person out on a conversational limb they never wanted to go on, and they say something to you. Step number 3 is to listen with the intent to understand, not to respond. Don't get defensive. Even though you asked for the feedback, when you hear it, you're likely to wince. You're likely not to be that happy about it if you're like most people. And so you want to make sure that you're managing your own emotions around getting the feedback. Simple technique here is simply to repeat back what you think you heard. So just to make sure I understood, I want to make sure that I'm right. So I'm going to tell you what I think I heard, and then repeat it back. Or ask a follow-on question. The other day, we were sitting at the breakfast table, and my daughter said to me, I wasn't asking for feedback, but I got some. My daughter, the one exception to the rule of nobody wants to give you feedback is your kids. Your kids kind of do want to give you some feedback. So my daughter said
Absolutely.
to me, I wish you weren't the radical candor lady. And this wave of parental guilt washed over me. And I thought, oh gosh, I'm spending too much time at work. I'm not giving her enough attention. So I'm now swimming in guilt. And then I think I should clarify. I should make sure I understood why she said that. And so I said, well, who do you wish I were? And she looked back at me and she said, I wish you were the lady who minded her own business. That's exactly the opposite of what I thought. So make sure you understand what the person is trying to tell you. Now that's good. You haven't reacted defensively, but there's a 4th step that's crucial, because when someone gives you feedback, they take a risk. And if you don't reward the risk, they'll never take it again. So you've got to reward the candor. If you agree with the feedback, fix the problem, and be as vocal as possible with that person and with others about how you fix the problem. Make sure you went far enough and not too far in fixing the problem. So solicit a little bit more feedback. But make sure that people know you heard them. You want to make your listening tangible. Now, there's other times, of course, where you will disagree with the feedback that you get. And maybe you are correct in your disagreement. Maybe you're incorrect. But either way, it's a little bit harder to reward the candor that you disagree with. So in those cases, the thing to do is to look for that 5%, 10% of what was said that you can agree with, and give voice to that just to prove that you're not simply being defensive. And then what you can do is say, for the rest of it, I want to think about it for a day or two. And then really do think about it. Make sure you're not in a defensive place. And then get back to them and offer a fuller, respectful explanation of why you disagree. Because disagreements are inevitable in relationships. Disagreements can even strengthen relationships sometimes. But ignoring someone never strengthens a relationship. Making them feel invisible is much worse than explaining why you disagree. So sometimes a fuller, respectful explanation of why you disagree is the best reward you can offer for that candor. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. It's great feedback for me and for our listeners. I heard somebody say once, when you're getting feedback, assume they're right. So if you reframe that moment as, I'm going to assume that what I'm hearing is right, and I'm going to try to approach it with that mindset, that can be a powerful shift. So how important is the frequency and the timing of giving guidance? I know you prefer the word guidance over feedback. Tell me a little bit
Yes.
about that.
So guidance instead of feedback. I think feedback is a word that to many people sounds screechy and makes us want to put our hands over our ears. Feedback also kind of implies criticism. And to me, guidance is as much about praise, probably more about praise than it is about criticism. You've got to do both, and you've got to take both equally seriously. And what I'm talking about when I talk about guidance is not the annual performance review. It is these 2-minute impromptu conversations. Almost all of the best feedback I've ever gotten in my career has happened in 2-minute conversations, just like the one I just described in the story, where I'm just walking after the meeting with someone and hearing their thoughts, either positive or negative, either praise or criticism. It's so these impromptu moments, as you just described with your boss who said she's not leaving right now, these impromptu moments really make up leadership. And there's good news and bad news about that. The good news is that these 2-minute conversations, they don't cost any money. They don't take extra time. The bad news is they take enormous emotional discipline. And it's really about building the habit of having these conversations that creates successful leadership moments.
And so what you're saying as a leader, when we feel this bubble up inside us, there's something here that I need to share to provide guidance. Do it. Don't walk away from it. Lean into it.
Yes, lean into it. Do it right away. I mean, unless you yourself are so angry, you're afraid you're going to wind up being obnoxiously aggressive. But we tell ourselves so many stories. Oh, I'll do it later. Oh, it'll be better tomorrow. It's not going to be better tomorrow. It's going to be harder tomorrow because it's going to, first of all, we all have a long list of things we have to do. If you can just do it right away, you don't have to keep it on your list. That's a great benefit. But also, a lot of good, both praise and criticism, involves explaining the situation, explaining the behavior, and then describing the impact. And if you do it right away, you're still in the situation. You don't have to remember the detail in that meeting. Remember that,
right? Like, sure.
So it's just more efficient to do it right away. And it also, if the person is making a mistake, the purpose of telling them about it is so they can correct it and so they don't repeat it. And the longer you wait, the more times you're going to repeat that mistake. So why wait?
Right, sure. Obviously all of this is better when there's trust at the core and the foundation of all this. How do you tell leaders to create trust quickly with people that work for them?
Yeah, radical candor and trust it can feel to leaders like a catch-22 situation because they sort of a very common excuse for not giving feedback, especially critical feedback, for not giving guidance, but also praise is, well, I don't know the person well enough. I haven't built trust yet, so I'm not going to do it. But the fact of the matter is, the seeds of trust get sown in these guidance moments. And so if you imagine, maybe it's a really thorny situation, but imagine that it's a simple situation. Imagine that we're talking about spinach in the teeth. Even if you're having lunch with someone for the very first time, if you notice that they have spinach in their teeth, the way you handle that is going to be how you build trust. So if you tell the person and you tell them in a way that is kind and not obnoxiously aggressive, then the person knows you have their back. They know you're telling them this to be helpful. They know you're telling them this because you care. And so you know that the way to build trust is to be radically candid about the spinach in the teeth. That's true of any situation, but it's obviously easier usually easier with someone who you do have a lot of trust with. But you can also get into a tricky situation where a relationship becomes characterized by so much sort of manipulative insincerity and ruinous empathy that it becomes really difficult to be radically candid. So it's really about getting in the habit of communicating in this way from the get-go.
Absolutely. One of the things you talk about in the book is rock stars and superstars on your team,
Yes.
and
Or
really
people, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you.
go, yeah,
People in rock star mode and people in superstar mode. So
right.
you don't want to use these things as, and I made the mistake in the book. I didn't manage to edit out all the mistakes, but it's really important to remember that people are in a mode. This is not a label to hang around
Got it.
someone's neck.
Okay, so they're either in rock star mode or superstar
Mhm.
mode. Is that what I'm hearing? And so,
Yes.
and can you talk more about that and how you as a team can learn how to value both?
Yeah, this is a lesson I learned from someone I worked with at Apple, an executive at Apple, and she said to me one day, a great team needs to have the right balance of people in superstar mode, people in rock star mode, and you need to manage them both differently. And I was like, what are you talking about? What's the difference between rock star and superstar mode? And she said, people, when they're in rock star mode, they are your rock of Gibraltar. They are solid as a rock. They don't necessarily want the next big job. They don't want your job. They don't want to be Steve Jobs, but they're great at their work. And if you don't screw it up, they'll keep doing it, often for years. But very often we undervalue those people. We save up the highest ratings for people who are in superstar mode, for people who want that next big job, who are gunning for the next promotion. And so we save up the best ratings, we save up bonuses, we save up so many of the rewards that we have to offer people for great work for people when they're in superstar mode. And that can really undervalue the people when they're in rockstar mode. And the rockstar mode is the source of stability on your team. Superstar mode may be the source of growth, but you need both. You need both.
No question.
Yeah, otherwise the wheels fly off the bus.
Absolutely. What and you talk about the difference between talent management and growth management. Can you share that a little bit more?
Sure. So, and in the second edition, I talk even more about this. But
And that second edition for our listeners is coming out in October. So
yes,
we're all on the lookout for
absolutely.
that. It's going to be awesome.
Yes. But when leaders are thinking about how to make sure that they are developing people on their teams in the right way, they often follow what's called a talent management process. And the problem with the word talent is it kind of implies that people have these innate attributes and they either have them or they don't have them. And I think that's a real problem. We want to get into a growth mindset where we're helping people improve. We're helping people grow. That it's not a matter of, you're either a people person or you're not a people person. You're either intuitive or you're not intuitive. You're either a math person or you're not. We're helping people build the skills that they need and helping people grow in the way they want to grow in their careers. And so I think very often people use sort of a framework where there's a potential performance matrix. And the problem with labeling some people as high potential and others as low potential is that feels really awful. And in fact, it is really awful. There's no such thing as a low potential human being. There are people, so I much prefer, are you on a steep growth trajectory or are you on a more gradual growth trajectory? And that's how I encourage people to help grow their teams and grow the individuals on their teams in a radically candid way, in a way that works for them. Does that make sense to you?
It does. But I have to ask you, you say in the book that there's no such thing as a B player. So
yes,
help me with that a little bit. Help me with that.
There are definitely people who are bad at their job, but that doesn't mean they are a B player. That's it just means they're bad at this job. But there's another job that they can be great at. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that managers make is they write off a portion of their teams, and often a big portion of their teams, as people who are just kind of meh. They're okay at the job. I'm not going to fire them. But they kind of write them off as B players, or they say we need B players. They are, Nobody wants to be a B player. That is not inspiring. So there are people who are okay at a job but not great. And those people, it's your job as a leader to help them find a role where they can be great, because everyone deserves to be proud of their work and to feel like they can achieve some level of excellence. So that's sort of what I mean when I say there's no such thing as a B player. In fact, I would really encourage my team, and in fact kind of push them, if not force them, to when somebody was getting kind of an average rating for too long, to really push that person outside of their comfort zone to see if they get pushed in their current role, can they really excel?
Mm-hmm.
And if they can't, can we encourage them to go find a role where they can excel?
Sure.
Because nobody wants to be labeled as a B player.
When I think about Radical Candor, and I think about this new book that you have coming out in October, which is awesome that you're updating it, what can your followers expect to be a little bit different in the new and updated version of Radical Candor that isn't in there now?
Sure. So the second edition, I mean, to be clear, it's mostly the same book, but there's a new foreword that I wrote explaining the biggest mistake that people make when trying to roll out Radical Candor. And then there's an afterword that Jason, Amy, and I, there's a big team of people working on helping companies roll out Radical Candor, but the three of us are sort of the early three people. And we described where we saw the book not go quite far enough, and explaining what the idea was and how you can put it into practice. And then there's a bonus chapter about how you can develop a radically candid performance review system. So that's what's new in the book. And I think the core idea of in the new chapters is that sometimes people use radical candor as an excuse to behave like a jerk, and that's what we're really trying to correct for. So sometimes I'll go into an organization and someone will walk into a meeting and say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they'll proceed to act like a garden variety asshole. and that's not radical candor. It pains me when I see this.
I bet.
And so we developed actually a new version of the 2x2. It's still called the Radical Candor Framework. But in the upper right-hand quadrant, where you do care personally and challenge directly, we call it compassionate candor. And we contrast compassionate candor with ruinous empathy, because sometimes empathy can paralyze us and make it harder to help somebody. And so we're trying to move people past that, but without losing the notion of caring personally and showing compassion.
Got it. And you said that in your research and as in your experiences, ruinous empathy is where most people end up. I mean, can you give me a number around that at all, Kim? I mean, is it 80% more? I mean, what is that?
So I would say in my experience rather than in my research, because I don't have what would be called in Silicon Valley terms data on this, but I do have tons of experience.
Yeah.
And in my experience, it's 85% of the time.
Wow.
The problem is ruinous empathy. It's the vast majority of the time.
That's incredible. So assuming that 100% of our listeners are in that 85% bucket, right? So I'm going to throw a big net out here. What would you, after they sort of finish listening to this podcast, what would you say is the one thing you want people that are in that ruinous empathy category to start doing and stop doing?
I think the one thing to start doing is think about that story. Think about that moment in your career where someone told you something that stung and it helped you for the rest of your career. And just remembering that story and keeping that top of mind is often going to prompt you to say something when you know you should, but you really don't want to. So I think that is one of the most important things people can start doing. I think the thing you can stop doing is making excuses to yourself for not saying anything. Become aware of the story you're telling yourself. Are you saying, oh, it'll hurt my relationship with this person? And to be clear, it might create an awkward moment, but nine times out of 10, you're going to find yourself pleasantly surprised by how receptive people are to your radical
Mhm.
candor. Now,
Absolutely.
I will be candid. One time out of 10, you're going to have a radical candor train wreck. But don't give in to negativity bias. Even when you do have a radical candor train wreck, it's possible to recover. It's
Absolutely.
possible to use that to the good. So I think another thing to start doing is to remember that radical candor is more about listening than talking. So remember to gauge the feedback. So you start out in a neutral place. In the story I told earlier, Cheryl didn't start out by saying, when you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid. She started out by saying, you said a lot in there. Were you aware of it? So she was definitely challenging directly, but she wasn't all the way at the outer edge of challenge directly. And she had to go there because she noticed my response. But start using the framework to learn how to start in a neutral place and then gauge the reaction of the other person and use their reaction to guide whether you need to focus on caring personally or challenging directly. So in the story, if somebody is ignoring what you're saying, you need to go further out on the challenge directly dimension. But sometimes you're going to get somebody will be sad or they'll be angry. You're going to get an emotional response. And when you get that emotional response, the key thing is to pause and move up on the care personally dimension. And that means sitting with the emotion, as uncomfortable as it is, not denying the emotion, not telling the person what to feel, not saying, please eliminate from your vocabulary the phrase, don't take it personally. Like, just never say that because we spend more time at work than in any other part of our lives. And when we feel like something's not going well, when we feel misunderstood, it does hit us in the gut. It's natural. So learn how to show compassion for the emotion that you're seeing. To just say, I can see I've upset you. I can see I've made you mad. And then to simply just ask, like, how can I help? Ask the question. Reassert your intention to be helpful in those moments.
Okay.
But when the person's not hearing you, you don't need to attend so much to the emotions in the room. You need to go further out on the challenge directly dimension. So
Like
distinguishing which way to go depending on the response you get is really important.
Kim, you've been so generous with your time. We end with a rapid fire section. I know you think on your feet, so we're going to fire here, and you just tell me what
Bring it
comes up.
on.
All right, let's do it. What's the last book you read?
The last book I read is Driven to Distraction.
Oh, I've read that too. That's a good one.
Book about ADD. Yeah, it's a good one.
Book you would recommend for leaders?
Book I would recommend for leaders. One of the best books for leaders is actually a novel. Middlemarch. I think leaders don't read enough novels.
Yeah, you're
such
right.
a big part of great leadership is really understanding people. And one of the best ways to build real compassion for other people is to read the great novels, the old classics. So go read Middlemarch.
Got it. Okay. Best guidance you've ever received?
Best guidance I've ever received was actually from my grandmother, who she had criticized me for something, and I was very upset about it. And she sat me down and she said, if you can learn to listen when other people criticize you, you will make so many fewer mistakes in your life. And Granny was right.
Yeah, she was. You took that one to heart, though, girl.
Yes.
A person who's had the biggest impact on your career?
One of the people who had the biggest impact on my career was my boss when I worked in Russia. And what he said to me was, he said, when I was a young man, I thought that my kindness was a liability in business, but I learned that my kindness was my greatest asset.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah.
A leader you most admire?
One of the leaders I most admire is actually Larry Page. I think he did so much at Google to create a culture where people would really challenge him and challenge him hard. And I loved that about working at Google, and I appreciated the many things he did. Some of them were small. I tell a story in the book about being in a meeting with someone who I really liked, who was really challenging Larry in a very, what I felt like was uncomfortable way. And I looked at Larry, and he had this big grin on his face, and he was sort of inviting the guy to continue. And I really liked that about the culture at Google. I learned a lot from that.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
What's your favorite leadership resource, right? So maybe it's a podcast, an app. What would that be?
I'm going to now give you a real confession.
Hit me. I love it.
I wrote this leadership book. I don't like most leadership books. I turn to fiction. I really do find that reading, I learn more about other people and these sort of important lessons more from fiction than from leadership books.
That's interesting. That's cool. Wow, I've never gotten an answer like that. That's neat. So the show's called Game Changers. So one last question. What game changer? So who's a game changer that inspires you and why?
You know, I have to say, I know a lot of people don't feel this way, but I really admire Elon Musk. I think his leadership style sometimes gets him in trouble, but I really admire what he's trying to do with Tesla and how he's trying to make the world a better place and really focus on the things that matter.
That's awesome. So, Kim Scott, thank you so much for coming on at the risk of being radically candid. You are awesome. Really, really appreciate you coming on. And you never said so thank you.
You know, I'll tell you what, the coach was enormously helpful.
Yes.
And telling that story over and over and over has made me hyper conscious.
I bet.
Not saying so much.
I bet. Well, Kim, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.